In 2011, a worker at an oil sands mine in Alberta, Canada, made one of the most exciting dinosaur discoveries of the 21st century. While digging up a cliffside, the worker's excavator struck an unusually hard object, peppered with large tan splotches. He had just discovered the remains of a 110-million-year-old nodosaur. Nodosaurs were a group of armored plant-eating dinosaurs that lived during the late Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. And paleontologists have been studying these dinosaurs since the 1830s, but nobody had ever found a specimen like this one before. Researchers at the Royal Tyrrell Museum named it Borealopelta markmitchellii after the technician who spent over 5 years cleaning up the fossil. It represented a completely new species, and that was just the beginning. Although the dinosaur's tail and a few other parts were missing, everything that was left was amazingly detailed. There was a gorgeous skull, articulated neck vertebrae, several leg and foot bones, and portions of the torso and hip regions. But it was the rest of the fossil that made international headlines. From the hips forward, Borealopelta had an almost complete set of osteoderms. Osteoderms are bony plates that are embedded in the skin, just like what alligators have today. Nodosaurs and many of their relatives had backs that were covered in osteoderms, possibly for defense. Better yet, Borealopelta contained super rare remnants of softer body materials, and even had traces of pigmentation, giving us important clues about the animal's color pattern. And the key to all this exceptional preservation was where Borealopelta ended up after it died and how it got there. Because the strange thing is, it was found lying on its back in a marine deposit. In other words, it was fossilized upside down underwater. And a lot of other nodosaur fossils have turned up in similar deposits, ones left behind by ancient waters. So how did these dinosaurs end up getting buried at sea? The answer to this question is a gross but also kind of cool process of decomposition called, wait for it, bloat and float. Nodosaurs belong to a larger group of herbivorous dinosaurs called ankylosaurs. Scientists have found their remains on most of the world's continents. Both nodosaurs and ankylosaurids often turn up in marine fossil deposits. Now, you might remember from our video when sharks swam the Great Plains that from about 95 to 68 million years ago, a huge body of water called the Western Interior Seaway split North America in half. And earlier in the Cretaceous, much of west central Canada and the upper Great Plains were covered by the Maori Sea, an extension of the Arctic Ocean. So there was a lot of available sea for the armored dinosaurs to end up in. For example, take the nodosaur known as Niobrarasaurus. It's known exclusively from the late Cretaceous marine deposits of western Kansas, and some of its fossils even bear the tooth marks of ancient sharks. And lots of other armored ankylosaurs, including nodosaurs, have been found in marine deposits, from places like Queensland, Australia, and James Ross Island, Antarctica. One species was even found in California with fossilized oysters encrusting on its bones. And then we have Borealopelta, the spectacular nodosaur that those Albertan miners came across. Its remains were discovered in the early Cretaceous Clearwater Formation, where the fossils of marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs often turn up, but scientists had never found any dinosaur material out there until Borealopelta. So what happened? Well, after its death, Borealopelta's corpse hit the seafloor around 200 to 400 kilometers away from the closest shoreline. And it landed upside down, which turns out to have been a common fate for nodosaurs. Computer simulations suggest that these top-heavy animals would have flipped over pretty easily while floating in the water. So below the waves, Borealopelta came to rest in a layer of stagnant, oxygen-poor mud. Traces of burrowing sea creatures were found nearby, but paleontologists found no evidence that the dinosaur's body was scavenged. And when it was discovered, Borealopelta was encased in a tomb of hard rock called a concretion. As its body decayed, carbon dioxide and other substances were released, which changed the chemistry of the water inside the mud around the carcass. Borealopelta's corpse hit the seafloor around 200 to 400 kilometers away from the closest shoreline. And it landed upside down, which turns out to have been a common fate for nodosaurs. Computer simulations suggest that these top-heavy animals would have flipped over pretty easily while floating in the water. So below the waves, Borealopelta came to rest in a layer of stagnant, oxygen-poor mud. Traces of burrowing sea creatures were found nearby, but paleontologists found no evidence that the dinosaur's body was scavenged. And when it was discovered, Borriella pelta was encased in a tomb of hard rock called a concretion. As its body decayed, carbon dioxide and other substances were released, which changed the chemistry of the water inside the mud around the carcass. Soon enough, a tough layer of siderite, a type of iron carbonate, formed, protecting the dinosaur's remains. But how did it get so far away from the coastline? After all, Borriella pelta was heavily armored and short-legged, so it was probably a terrible swimmer, and it lived on land anyway, so there's no reason to think that the nodosaur swam to its watery grave. It's more likely that the dinosaur's body was washed out to sea. Sometimes after an animal dies and bacteria start breaking it down, gases build up inside the corpse. And if the carcass ends up in a body of water while that's happening, it might start bobbing around at the surface. Scientists call this phenomenon bloat and float. Eventually, those gases escape, the body stops floating, and it sinks to the bottom. And no matter where an animal dies, there's a good chance its remains will get scattered around after death. But the concretion around Borriella pelta kept most of its skeleton together. Better yet, the rocky shell helped the dinosaur retain its three-dimensional shape, even as layers of sediment piled up on the carcass over time. Between the bloat and float process and the seafloor environment where it landed, Borriella pelta kind of hit the jackpot in terms of preservation. For example, along with those osteoderms, experts found that the fossil was also covered with tiny polygonal scales on much of its skin, and delicate skin structures were spread out across the skull, neck, back, hips, and even its legs. Plus, many of the dinosaur's osteoderms, along with other parts of the body, were coated in a dark gray material. This stuff has been identified as a kind of organic film, and it's loaded with the chemical traces and byproducts of keratin. Keratin is a key ingredient in fingernails, hooves, feathers, and hair, and some modern reptiles, like alligators, have keratin sheaths over their osteoderms. Unfortunately, keratin often vanishes without a trace during the fossilization process. But the organic film on Borriella pelta preserved the original three-dimensional structure of the keratin sheaths that covered and lengthened the bony osteoderms when the dinosaur was alive. The ones on Borriella pelta's shoulder spikes are a centimeter thick in some places, and make up about 20 from a little camouflage. Without the amazing preservational environment created by the concretion and the whole bloat and float thing in the first place, we wouldn't have any clue what color this huge dinosaur was or what it ate. And that brings us to a soccer ball-sized lump found in Borriella pelta's abdominal cavity. In 2020, Royal Tyrrell paleontologist Caleb forever if it hadn't bloated and floated across an inland sea. In death, this creature beat the odds, evading scavengers and the ravages of fossilization before it survived the mining process and caught an equipment operator's eye. By doing all this, it's given us a bounty of dinosaurian knowledge. So here's to Borriella pelta markmitchellii, an improbable ambassador from the early Cretaceous.
Hi YouTube, this is Vessel of Christ Jesus here with part 1 of my Science of the Great Flood series. This one's going to be focusing on paleontology and the evidence that is within the field of the studying of dinosaurs and fossils, and what proof there is proving a biblical worldwide flood. Now, this is going to be part 1, and I'm going to be showing you guys a video called The Dinosaur Who Was Buried at Sea. And this was a video made in 2020 by PBS Eons. There's going to be a link in the description below if you want to watch the entire video. It's called The Dinosaur Who Was Buried at Sea. And I'm going to show you guys a Clip Notes version of what they're saying. But it's stuff like this that blows my mind, to where scientists can be so smart and so blinded at the same time. She is literally describing the flood without even realizing it. So while watching this clip, I want you to really pay attention to what she's saying. Okay, this dinosaur is called a Notosaurus, and it was found in 2011. Okay, some of the things she says, it was fossilized upside down underwater. Okay, and other Notosaurs have been found in similar ways. These fossils have been found, these ones, she said, are left behind by ancient waters. Okay, and after its death, it hit the sea floor 300 miles away from the closest shoreline. So this dinosaur that was a land-dwelling animal basically bellied up and drowned in an ocean. Okay, how did it get there? And why are other notosaurs found in similar ways within the fossil record? I also want you guys to look at the death pose. Okay, the death pose is evidence of a biblical flood. As I said before, about 80% of the fossil record was caused by the flood. It's called the Great Dying. Okay, and also after the flood, God broke apart Pangea. So a lot of dinosaurs died out because of that. The earth changed, the oxygen levels. He destroyed everything with water, and he made the earth new again. So I just want you guys to pay attention to what she's saying here. She is describing the flood. Okay, the way this dinosaur was fossilized, it takes rare conditions to do that. It was buried at sea, so it died. It sank to the bottom of the seafloor, okay, because it drowned. They can't swim. And immediately it was covered by sediments, okay, and that can only be caused by a worldwide flood. So, and also they do not explain how this land dinosaur ended up in an ocean. And not only this one, this isn't an isolated incident. There are many, many fossils of notosaurs all over the globe. And it's not just from the West Interior Seaway, okay? That's how it made, that was the water that killed this dinosaur, okay? So I'm just going to play the clip and I will explain later. But there is such a science to the flood. God broke up the deep, okay? And he opened up the windows of heaven. The floodgates were opened. And earth the water levels rose in a 6-month period, okay? And then it took another 6 months for the waters to go down so Noah and his family could get out, okay? So they were aboard the ark for a year. And even the way God describes it, the ice age, okay? I have so much to say, but first let us focus on paleontology and this dinosaur that was buried at sea.